Hi there. My name is Caitlin White. I'm the director at the Wesley Foundation at Stetson University, where we are trying to do campus ministry a little different for Christ's sake. Kim Scacia is on our board, and we are very fortunate to have her support. And whether y'all know it or not, you actually hosted our students for their fall leadership retreat. We used some of your education space, so we are grateful for that and your ongoing participation in your local Wesley Foundation. So I am the director there, but I hold two other jobs because why not? I am also one of the pastors at Collective Church in DeLand, and I am on the Florida conferences team for Fresh Expressions all across the state. And so there, the emphasis of my work is about helping people realize that church can happen anywhere. It's about getting the church out of the building, meeting the Spirit in what it's doing in the lives of those who we are not already reaching. So it's things like telling parables and discussing them over a pint at a local brewery, or having a yoga service under the stars, or hosting a Sunday soul brunch at a local venue instead of in a traditional church space, so that people who will not darken the door of your average church will come in and they'll try it and they'll have an experience of God. It's about hosting church around dinner tables. It's a pretty ancient practice and one that Methodists are always a big fan of. Food is always the first step. So when we say Fresh Expressions, we mean that those are experiences of church planted primarily for the benefit of the unreached. And so my work is about making what was once the mission edge with unchurched people and the marginalized. I'm trying to make that into the mission center. So it's not just that weird pastors with crazy backstories and lots of tattoos can innovate, but that anybody can. Anybody can disciple with a passion and a courage to try and to risk failure. And I try to incorporate that into all the things I do. So as a pastor for Christian education with all ages, I'm trying to incorporate that by doing things differently. As a campus minister, I'm trying to incorporate that. And so I have some thoughts for you all for today. And this work, this unusual form of church, this is my calling because I was that unchurched person. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, heart of the Bible Belt, did not find a church home until my late teens. So my family really wanted to find a church community where they could belong. They church shopped when, I can't tell you, we tried every denomination at least once. I got to do vacation Bible school at every church in town. And we were seeking a place to belong, but we kept getting the message that we didn't fit. So we'd show up, and it turns out we didn't have our theology all worked out. We didn't believe exactly the right things in exactly the right way. Or maybe we were an imperfect family. You know, my parents suffered a lot of loss and grief, and they had a lot of questions. Like, why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? You know, crazy questions that nobody else would ever ask, right? And somehow it always kind of seemed like we had to dress completely right, and we had to have our checkbook open, and we had, it was almost like we couldn't show up and find out what they were all about. We had to already be their perfect person, or we couldn't belong. Until we found an unusual United Methodist church called Heart Song that was founded out of the recovery movement. It was actually planted from an AA group. And so what's really neat about that is that non-judgment is the first step. Unconditional belonging is the first step. So they were upfront about their flaws. They didn't ask us to conform so that we could fit in and be just like everybody else. They gave us the gift of being ourselves and being able to belong, to be deeply known and loved just as we are. And so ever since then, I became captivated by the Christian tradition and by the message of Jesus and by the community of faithful co-conspirators who are following him still. But it's strange, like as soon as I got involved with this church thing, I started hearing this story that the church is telling right now about church decline. Anybody familiar with this idea, like the church is dying? Has anyone heard the bad news? I know it was just Halloween, right? It's scary. But you've probably heard stats like this. Like every year, more than 4,000 churches close their doors, and only about 1,000 new ones start. Or every year, about 2.7 million church members fall into inactivity. They just stop showing up. Or half of all churches in the United States did not add any new members in the last 2 years. No professions of faith, no baptisms. And that the United States now ranks third, right behind China and India in the total number of people who are not professing Christians. In other words, the U.S. is becoming an ever-increasing unreached people group. Right? Other countries are sending missionaries to the U.S. faster than the American church can send them abroad. They see us as a mission field. And so I wonder why it is that the stats are telling us that we don't see our own backyard as a mission field. And when it comes to that kind of shift, I think the readings this morning attest that we aren't in new territory. The text from Jeremiah and from Mark both speak about times of change and shifting understanding. And I think they bring a message of hope. So we're going to hold on to that hope and we're going to come back to it. In Jeremiah, it's very clear. Something has come to an end. New chapters are opening. That change, even conflict, is a natural, normal part of life. For Jeremiah, it's pretty clear on this point. He speaks from this context of Jewish exile, and he says, just as I have watched over them to pluck up and break down, to overthrow, destroy, and bring evil, so I will watch over them to build and to plant. He's reminding us that change comes around, and while it can bring upheaval, it can be uncomfortable, it also brings purpose and growth. God is present in destruction and rebirth. It's pretty straightforward. But then we get to the figs, and things are getting a little weird. I hear Pastor Tom was talking about this parable last week as well. This odd metaphor about the fig tree that fails to bear fruit bookends the corruption of the temple and the religious elite. And it's very hard to make heads or tails of what's going on here. On the surface, we get the sense that Jesus gets angry when the religious establishment becomes hypocritical and unconcerned with the actual needs of real people. The story seems to speak of institutions in need of change, unmet expectations, questions about fruitfulness over time, right? Seems to be a tidy story about the tradition of reform, naming the unjust, the corrupt, superficial aspects of the tradition, flipping the tables and dragging it into the light and then changing. But then there's this little detail that I think hints at something more. If we consider that it isn't even the right season for figs, it gets a little weird. Like, it's hard to read that and not find that strange. Like, Jesus, did you know? It's just the wrong season. There's no reason to freak out. And if you've ever been confused by that yourself, don't worry. Bible commentators don't have a better idea. They have surprisingly little consensus on why God hates figs so much. In fact, the author of Matthew tells the same story, but writes that part out, that it's not the season for figs, writes it out of the story. Probably because it makes Jesus look like he's having a temper tantrum, right? This theatrical, symbolic act of cursing the fig tree that is out of season, it doesn't resolve itself. It's open-ended, which allows us to step into the story with our own ideas. Because personally, I can relate. It seems to me that Jesus gets hangry and takes it out on this poor tree. Relatable. Pretty sure I had a car wreck this week. Pretty sure is directly related to hunger. Just letting you know. Or lack of coffee. I think it's a deeply human moment that I know that I embody, especially when we pair it with changes in things as meaningful and personal to many of us as church and religion. Sometimes things come to an end. Sometimes it isn't the right season for the thing that we want. Meanwhile, we're on the side of the road having a meltdown because we went looking for something in the wrong time and in the wrong place. It's very human to be frustrated and disappointed, and it's known to make us a little bit destructive. It might be one of the most appropriate parables, then, for times like ours, because it's so confusing. And so I don't share the belief that the end of Christendom, that's the global power system, as we might say, with Christianity at the top, or the culturally dominant identity, where the assumption on the street is the person I'm interacting with must be Christian, right, because they're a person. The idea that that era is ending, I don't think is a bad thing, and I'll tell you why in just a moment. But I can empathize, even as I think we're on the brink of something new and exciting. I can empathize with someone who is grieving that their church is dying. I can understand being angry and defensive. If in our time and in the religious establishment of Christian dominance, figs are a symbol for power or money or numbers, I do think that the church has been looking for figs in the wrong season. But like any parable, this is an invitation because it's unclear. We're looking for something, we don't know what season it is. It raises questions that we don't have all the answers to. And this story is just big enough and open enough to hold both the principle and the personal. All the reasons that the process of reformation needs to happen over and over again, and the reality that it feels a lot like heartbreak to those who experience it. From the moment that I came to faith, I was bombarded with this church decline story and all the anxiety around it. Like, hey, you're new to the church, help us rescue it. And it's strange to me that people started telling me how the church was dying when I had just discovered new life. See, that wasn't really the story about what was happening on the mission edge. I knew something else was going on there. And this bears out in history. So this isn't just anecdotal, sometimes your church is doing well, sometimes it's not. This isn't a new phenomena or the first time that the church has experienced an evolution like this. In the history of Western Christianity, the church has had a constant struggle between power and progress, and it results in an interesting pattern. A theologian named Phyllis Tickle, who has the best name in theology, I think we can all agree, writes about a historical trend that keeps emerging. She argues that every 500 years, the church cleans out its closets and has a rummage sale. They drag everything out in the light. They go through a tremendous time of change and reorientation, and then they figure out a new way to go forward. So follow me on this. We're roughly 500 years into the growth of the early church, and we see our first big shift. The early church got a first taste of power when a few of the Roman elite became Christian, and it takes almost no time at all until the destruction of the Roman Empire plunges us into the Dark Ages. All the efforts of the councils that established the canon and structured our theology is nearly wasted. Clergy become illiterate, the church becomes corrupt, theological consensus is lost, but a wise minority of early church mothers and fathers established monasticism. They separated themselves from society in order to preserve the tradition and safeguard our liturgy. They copied manuscripts, they maintained holy spaces, holding the church in trust for future generations. So fast forward about 500 more years, and we come to the Great Schism. That's the Eastern Orthodox Church breaking away from the Catholic Church in 1054. But it didn't all happen at once. It's not like it happened that year and that was new information for them. It came at the end of a century of political and social tension that resulted in Western Christianity alienating Middle Eastern and African Christianity. It was about each feeling threatened and disenfranchised. And so the church experienced its first painful separation, and the two traditions spread in opposite directions, speaking to different people on either end of the politics of their time. As painful as it was, the gospel went further because of it. So 500 years later, we get to the last great rummage sale, the one that we're all most familiar with. That's the Protestant Reformation. And because the church is, at least in many ways, a human creation, a social construct, it doesn't live in a vacuum. Each of these eras of radical change are accompanied by technological advances, new media, the reorganization of society and power. These things don't just happen in the church, they're going on in all of our culture and society. So for the Reformation, I was going to say the Restoration, so that'll be something else another time. For the Reformation, we know that the printing press made it possible for people to access the Bible in their own language. We know what a big change that created. But we have to bear in mind that while they began to read sacred texts for themselves, that's not all they were reading. Ideas about science and politics were spreading rapidly. People were learning new religions, languages, rather. Ships were setting sail in all directions. The world was getting bigger, and people had more control over their individual experience. So it's no wonder that Christianity had to evolve to give people more agency and to make more room for diverse ideas. And with that freedom came divisiveness. But this spread of ideas, this yearning for freedom of religious expression, this new era of mobility and trade, meant that the narrative, the tradition, the community, the church evolved. It spread further while engaging more and different people than it ever had before. So each of these eras was both terrifying and exciting to the people who lived through them. They mourned the changes in the traditions they loved, and they bravely adapted to their expanding world. When we can see these patterns in hindsight, we realize that these changes always opened the church up with new ideas and made it more accessible to those on the outside. It's easier to see hope in hindsight, right?